Welcome to the Author's Pen. I'm Dr. Judy Curtis, Associate Professor of Journalism at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, and our guest today is Mr. George Brock, author of Out of Print, Newspapers, Journalism, and the Business of News in the Digital Age. The book takes a fascinating look at journalism's past and how it evolved and is still evolving today with the impact of digital technology. And it looks at what it might become in the future. Mr. Brock is an experienced newspaper man who worked for The Observer and The Times in London, where he was managing editor. He now is a journalism professor and heads the Graduate School of Journalism at City University London. Welcome, Mr. Brock.
Thank you, Judy. Very nice to be here.
First, let me say this is an engaging book that is important for both students of journalism and consumers of news to read, to understand what is happening in the field of journalism. Let's start with the past. Mass media have had to adjust to new technologies before. Newspapers to radio and television, radio to television, and now everyone to the internet. You make the point that this time the changes wrought by digital technology, to use your words, are transformative and not adaptive. Explain more about why this time is different.
Well, I think, Judy, that I call the change transformative because this is rolling waves of change. What we're going to have is not just one set of changes and then it's going to stop changing. We're going to get successive waves of change as digital technology evolves, moves, proliferates, multiplies, and above all, does very unexpected things, which is what big transformative changes do. And it's not the first time there's ever been transformative. It's certainly a very, very large change. And one of the things that journalists will have to do, get used to being in the midst of that change and get comfortable with it. And of course, the previous age of journalism, by which I mean the late 20th century age, had been an extremely secure, calm, stable age. And while that's very good in itself, it equipped journalists very badly for adapting to rapid waves of change.
You identify many of the challenges facing journalism today, and you write a new challenge for journalism is coping with abundance. Explain that a little bit for our audience.
What I really mean is that when people began calling journalism journalism, which in Britain was in about the first third of the 19th century, so a long time ago, reliable information, and actually information of any kind, reliable or unreliable, was really quite scarce. It just wasn't much of it. In the 21st century, one of the really big differences is we're awash with information. We may not necessarily have much more reliable information, but we do have a lot of stuff. Information is coming at us from all directions, all hours of the day. I don't need to underline the point as obvious to everybody with a smartphone. I quote somebody in the book, a millionaire, who says that the average Kenyan with a smartphone today has access to more information than Bill Clinton had when he was president of the US. Now, I suspect actually that Bill Clinton had slightly better information, but in terms of the quantity, you see what I mean. So there's a lot of information, and therefore one of the things that journalists have to do to adapt and get alongside what's going on is they have to think out what being in an abundant information world is about. It makes journalism with more of an emphasis on things like curation and verification than it does necessarily just going out and acquiring information. Although I do find when I talk to journalism students that they do also have to remember that you don't just do journalism from a desktop. Sometimes we have to do exercises where we have to say to our students, look, you're not going to learn the answer to this question by staring into a screen. You've got to get out, feet on the street, and actually find out from people what's going on.
That's good advice, and we'll get back a little more in a little bit to some advice for beginning journalism students. I sense that you are optimistic about journalism's future, if not about any one individual publication's survival. You make the point that the fact that journalism will change is not the same as its ruin. What is there about journalism that will ensure its survival?
Well, I think that journalism is a very strong, embedded idea. Now, you could immediately point out to me that if you take the world as a whole, journalism and the strength with which it is embedded in societies varies a lot from country to country. You or I could quickly and easily list countries in which the idea of journalism and its importance and its value is not particularly strongly appreciated. But if we're talking about Europe and America, I think the idea is really very strongly embedded. I think it's very unduly pessimistic of journalists to say that if some of the infrastructure of journalism collapses or it's ground down because its business model is crumbling, that actually that means that journalism as a whole isn't going to happen. One of the things we can see happening around us right now today, online news sites, not only doing journalism, but actually reinventing it in some way. Journalism's always done that, always moved on, it's taken new challenges and new changes and shifted onto them. I happen to be talking to you today, the very first day that a graduate of my journalism school has taken a staff news reporting job at the UK edition of BuzzFeed. And that's a little kind of watershed moment here. I've no doubt others will take these jobs in the future, but it's the first time it's happened here.
Well, congratulations to that student, and you have some discussion of BuzzFeed in the book as well. You touched on different countries having different values about journalism. The book includes many current examples of the influence of journalism on several different countries. You write, the circulation and publishing of information, or attempt to suppress that freedom, has been pivotal to insurrections in history. Tell us a little bit about the role of digital media in the Arab Spring and in China.
Well, I think dealing with the Arab Spring first, we all know that a lot of people said that the revolution that actually turned out not to be a revolution in Egypt was, the first Facebook and Twitter revolution. And not only was that not quite true, but that myth turned out to, I think, maybe even do some harm to the original revolution in Egypt, because it made people feel that they had more popular support, that they had it on Facebook or on Twitter around the world. Actually, they had more support in Egypt than in fact was truly the case. So I think people have got to be very careful about building myths about this kind of things. One of the things that I say in the book is that if you're looking to see how technology had an effect in the Arab Spring in 2011, 2012, one of the things you've got to look at is the power of satellite television, almost more, I think, than Facebook. Social network media were quite important in that way. If you really look at the technology drivers of political change, such as it has happened in the Middle East, and let's not forget it hasn't gone that far, but it's probably the candidate for that is satellite television, because satellite television has a footprint that crosses borders. And a very important decision was made by the Emir of Qatar, actually, the tiny, tiny state in the Persian Gulf. Now, that state finances Al Jazeera. One of the things that it did with Al Jazeera was a big break with the past. It allowed Al Jazeera to report on other Middle Eastern countries, small and large, and say basically what they liked about them. And when those governments complained to Qatar and said, it's outrageous what your journalists are saying about Syria or Tunisia or whatever it happened to be, the Qataris just ignored them. That change, that shift in attitudes of allowing satellite TV-driven journalism to do its work probably did more than Facebook and Twitter in the Arab Spring revolutions. Now in China, quite a different situation. There you have an enormous state power, absolutely and explicitly determined to control how information is seen and how it's circulated. But even there, the authorities, powerful as they are, strong as their grip on the country may remain, they have had to adapt to Chinese Facebook and to social networking. And there are, I wouldn't say that there are cracks in the edifice exactly, but the state has had to work very, very hard in China to maintain its grip. The other thing, of course, we have to remember about places like China is that digital communications are absolutely terrific for people who want to keep an eye on other people. It's kind of what the definition of the inception. When you talk about digital communications, is appallingly easy. That's change just now. What changes we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years is people thinking really hard, particularly if they're doing dangerous journalism in authoritarian countries or totalitarian countries. They're going to have to think really hard about how the NSA and
Do you see the free
sorry.
Do you see the free flow of information in every country as inevitable as a result of widespread access to digital technology?
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't be that blithely optimistic, I'm afraid. Firstly, as I said, digital technology affords authoritarian, totalitarian regimes, if they control the technology and they research the technology and they buy the technology, so I don't think that there is any particular technological fix for forward. There will occur situations in which technology might make some contribution somewhere, somehow, but I don't, I'm afraid, think that democratization is completely inevitable anywhere. Technology will help here and there, but it's not necessarily a magic fix.
As you demonstrate in the book, the traditional economic business model no longer is supporting newspapers, even though the need for those who can sift through information and make sense of it still exists. Do you see the same progression eventually in over-the-air broadcast? Is there a counterpart book coming titled Off the Air?
That's a great question. I think that the conditions really are very, very different. The erosion of the business model in print has been much harder and more drastic than any erosion of the business model of what we call here terrestrial television, i.e. what you might call network, ordinary, standard network television. Now, you can say, well, you can carry television over the internet, and if you can carry television over the internet, isn't it going to undermine ordinary, standard, established broadcasting just like it established the business model? Well, firstly, the broadcasting organizations are a little bigger, more than once works. They may have more slack to withstand the erosion of their business model. Secondly, there is the public service broadcasting model, which is often, if necessarily, controlled by the state, set up by the state. It's guaranteed and sometimes protected by legislation. They're fine so far. They have £4 billion worth, obviously billion dollars worth of income every year from the taxpayer. So they're okay so far. So I don't think that the erosion and decline of terrestrial television will be quite the same, and I'm not planning a volume called Off the Air at the moment.
Okay, of course, in this country we don't have the support of the government as the BBC does. Finally, you describe journalism as an idea and a set of values. There's a need for those who seek truth and hold power accountable. What is your advice to students thinking about majoring in journalism?
Oh, don't be discouraged by older journalists who tell you that it's all going to ruin, because it's not. Journalism recovers, journalism vacuums get filled historically, and get out into the field. Don't worry about the fact that there may be fewer established jobs. Go for places which are expanding, which are reinventing, which are agile. They may be lean and mean, but if they are reinventing well and they are agile, then they will grow those businesses. So be prepared to work somewhere smaller is part of my advice, but try to get into the reinvention rather than going into backward-looking media organizations, which are likely to have trouble. We happen to be talking today, Judy, on the day that the first graduate of my school has taken a news reporting job with BuzzFeed. That's the British edition of BuzzFeed based in London. It's a little watershed for us.
Well, that's wonderful news. And you write in the book that journalism will survive if its reinvention takes the best of the past into a new communications age. You talk about the activities that define journalism, verification, sense-making, witness, investigation. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what the best of the past means in those terms.
Well, for example, one of the classes that I teach here is a writing class for people on our... We still have a master's in newspaper journalism, and we have a master's in interactive journalism, and I teach a combined class there. And occasionally the students ask me, they say, why are we learning about how to edit down, for example, how to condense, how to write in a compressed, distilled way? And I say, well, so long as the people are going to be using words as means of communication, that's to say the written word, and people are using the written word a lot on the internet, so long as we're using that, then you're going to need some of these skills for writing clearly, writing plainly, writing accurately, and being able to compress and distill. We're using these skills in a slightly different context. We'll write them for a different platform. You may write in different patterns because that's how the consumers will like it best. But nevertheless, the basic skill of writing well, for example, is, I'm absolutely sure, a skill of the future just as it was a skill of the past.
Well, and I emphasize that to my students as well. And you say in the book, writing and editing will continue to matter. What about the idea of investigation and holding those in power to account? Talk a little bit about that, and in terms of what's been happening lately in London.
Well, one of the things, of course, that is hardest hit by the financial decline of established print media has been investigative journalism. Investigative journalism happens both in broadcast media and in print media, but print media have been very important to it, partly because long written narrative is very suitable often for investigative journalism. And as the business model declined, investigative journalism tended to be squeezed out, and it lost out a bit on British television too from the 1980s onwards. But one of the things that I'm encouraged by is that new online sites do a lot of expensive, long-term investigative work. When I was researching the book, I was in New York about a year ago, it was actually January, and for the whole week that I was in New York, the sports page agenda was set for days on end by a story that had appeared in Deadspin, the sports site from Gawker, about an American football player who'd been lying about his backstory. And this extraordinary story, just as I say, completely seized everybody's imagination. It got an enormous number of hits, and every print publication was following it up. So there is good investigative journalism going on. Some of it is being financed by philanthropy. I'm a trustee of an organization in London called the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which is modeled fairly much on ProPublica in the US. It's not unfortunately as rich as ProPublica, but we're trying to acquire it more money all the time, and it does investigative reporting, which then it tries to sell either to television companies or to newspapers and magazines, and it will probably go forward and do publishing on its own, in its own right. So there is a very large, if you total it all up, there is a very large amount of activity going on to support investigative journalism. Indeed, when sometimes I tend to say I'm less worried about investigative journalism than I am about, for example, arts and literary journalism, which really is being decimated by the collapse of the print business model. And I think in many ways, arts and literary reporters and critics are having a tougher time finding work than investigative journalists often are.
Online media to find the support of advertisers. You mentioned that one of the questions to ask is journalism doing something of public value? it's hard to monetize the value of journalism. Do you have any ideas on how the digital world may be able to make a profit?
Well, I should say up front, I should admit that I do not have a financial silver bullet idea for saving journalism. I think that the business model for the future will probably consist of a number of elements. It's unlikely to be a one-size-fits-all magic scheme like advertising was print and a limited number of terrestrial television channels. One of the things is that advertising revenue apart from anything else is being shared among a vastly larger number of players now, so it's difficult for people to see on. I think that in some cases, specialist sites making quite a lot of income from in places as varied as Korea and Texas from conference and associated activity. Some journalism is doing book publishing to raise money. Some are using philanthropic bridging money. Some are using subscriptions. Some are changing their advertising model towards what I think is known in the States as native advertising, what we tend to call advertorial, sponsored journalism. There are lots of risks and dangers in sponsored journalism, but some combination of these things will work eventually and work consistently. But I think the pattern will be much more varied and different to the single dominant advertising income that we've had in the past.
Yes, it is going to change, as your book definitely points out. It needs to change. One of the activities that you mentioned that defines journalism, the idea of verification, and it seems to me that that's very important in today's world of abundant news. How do we know what we can trust as consumers of news? How do we know what we can trust that we find on the internet?
When I talk about verification in the book, I'm not just talking about sites like Storyful, which has just been bought by Vox and which was organized around the idea, it was started in Ireland actually, organized around grouping the techniques by which you can check whether a piece of grainy video which arrives from Syria is real or it isn't. But I'm also talking about the disciplines by which people don't rush into publishing stuff because they're panicked into doing it. Understandably, American journalism had a lot of arguments after the Boston Marathon bombings when some people rushed not into print but onto the web or onto their sites with information that subsequently turned out to be both defamatory and wrong about suspects and pictures and so on. And therefore, even established organizations, some of whom got caught in that particular firestorm, established organizations have got to rewrite their procedures and their rule books and how they do things and how they teach people, because you've just got to be very, very careful to verify. And if you lose trust by not verifying carefully enough, obviously, once trust is gone, it takes a very long time to rebuild.
You talk in the book about that maybe the term that is sort of an insider journalese term, gatekeeper, maybe is going to be turned into something more that means gate watcher. And you talk about that it may one day seem odd that societies had a large group of well-paid professionals whose job it was to select and provide the words and images that people looked at to know the world beyond what they could see and hear of their own eyes. Explain a little more what you're thinking there in the far future.
Well, I certainly think that gate watcher may be a better term than gatekeeper, which I don't think describes anything very exact. And obviously what gate watcher is intended to convey is that there is an enormous amount of information flowing past everybody. And to some extent, people will value, we have yet to discover how much they're going to pay for it, but people will value somebody who says, I've looked at everything about this subject. This is what I think is right, or what I know to be right. But I think it was quite odd that there was this very, very separate cast of they learned through words they couldn't see. Now they're getting information. Check what they're getting, to filter and mix and generally make sure that what they're getting is a wide range of possible sources of information. And therefore, I think in 100% of the time, how odd. They may even think it's odd that people spend their full time activity doing this. People just may do it with part of the practice. I'm personally inclined to believe that there will be specialists doing verification, sense-making, investigation, eyewitness stuff for a long time to come. But it could be that we will have a very large population of people who are kind of part-time journalists, particularly community journalists, where it's very difficult to make particularly in local community journalism. It may be also priests and engineers and secretaries and moms and everything else. They may just only do journalism as part of what they do.
Well, and you give some interesting examples of that in the book, of what's happening in New Jersey. And in this country, newspapers have been very much local entities, and we don't have the national newspapers as you do in we don't have as many national newspapers as you do in Great Britain. So the idea of the local news in the local block, attracting the local dry cleaner down the street to advertise is something that we haven't been able to achieve yet. Some companies here have tried to think about how they could get that through a website, but nobody's been entirely successful at that yet. But I found your examples of people doing journalism who that's not their primary job, but they're providing the information that people need in their community, such as after Hurricane Sandy here on our East Coast. Very fascinating, and that may be part of what the future holds. You mentioned in the book what the result ought to be and what it might be. The result of this revolution is not the same thing. In closing up, do you have a couple thoughts about that?
Well, I think that I'm generally very optimistic about journalism in the medium term. It obviously has difficulties in the short term. Jobs have been lost, some publications have closed, and so on and so forth. And we have that happening in Europe too, just as much as you do, well, not quite as much as you do in America, but the same thing roughly. But in the medium term, as I say, I think it's a very well embedded idea. And the funny thing about journalism is that when something goes wrong, not necessarily immediately, but in this case probably a few years later, something else bubbles up. And somebody does something to inform people, be it at a national or a community or a local level, or just in an occupational community perhaps spread geographically. The internet is very good at serving that. Somebody tells something, somebody tells people something that they find valuable, they find interesting. They may not intend to do journalism. They may not intend to, as we say, commit journalism. But after a bit, if they keep doing it and they turn out to be really inspired at it, hey, they're doing journalism. And I give an example in the book of a guy who was doing journalism by this rather accidental route, who then had to go out and buy a whole load of journalism textbooks because he realized he was doing journalism. He thought, well, if I'm going to do journalism, I'd better do it properly. I'd better know what proper practice and correct practice in the style book actually is. So he went out and he did that. There's always an improvisational, experimental, do-it-yourself edge to journalism. We're never going to get away from that because it's something that is constantly has to adapt and to change and in order to do that, you absolutely have to experiment.
Well, that's a very positive note to come to a close with our discussion with Mr. George Brock. Thank you very much for being with us here today. And
my pleasure.
We look forward to you visiting the States, as you mentioned, in a couple of weeks, and we hope you enjoy your visit.
I hope to be at UNC Chapel Hill on March the 19th.
Well, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. And we hope
you.
the audience has enjoyed our talk with Mr. Brock and will join us again for our next author's pen.